Thank you very much, Adam. I'm not sure I recognize the person you just described, but I look forward to meeting him one day. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. I want to use this as an epigraph, as a way into this lecture. From Leonard Cohen's Song of Isaac. Thought I saw an eagle, but it might have been a vulture. I never could decide. In the autumn of 1929, Lottie Paul left her Somerset village home for Goldsmiths College in London to pursue her ambition of becoming a schoolteacher. The summer following her first year of study was not over when her mother, Elizabeth, died suddenly of heart failure, forcing Lottie to abandon her planned career and remain home, where she provided domestic support to her father and two brothers. Here's a picture of Lottie. 17 years later, and only a few short miles away, school pupil Brian Webb was selected, looking suitably roguish, was selected by his tutors to study for an open scholarship to Cambridge. The scholarship promised enormous opportunities to a working-class teenager growing up in a provincial town. One schoolmate who won a similar scholarship later served as a cabinet minister. But Brian did not pursue his studies. The acrimonious divorce of his parents forced him to leave school and the family home and set out on a more arduous route that led towards a prosperous career, but no further than the small town where he was raised. Lottie Paul was my maternal grandmother. Brian Webb is my father. Lottie passed away many years ago, but I'm delighted, as Adam has already said, that my father is here tonight, along with my mother Marjorie and brother Paul. In recounting his story to me, my father remarked that he could have taken the same path as I later followed. I'd like to think that in becoming, along with my brothers, the first generation on either side of our family to receive a university education, that Lottie and Brian were our travelling companions in spirit. The support my family has given me at every stage of my academic study means they are as deserving of any certificate or title I possess. In choosing to study the United States, I've also been blessed by brilliant teachers who continue to inspire and support me. I owe debts that I cannot repay to Tony Badger, to Richard Carwadine, to Robert Cook, and to William Dusenbury. All of them, not only formidable scholars, but also blessed with unfailing patience and kindness. I want to express particular gratitude this evening for my own transatlantic special relationship. My partner Kathy hails from the prairies of Western Canada. She is the uncredited co-author not only of my scholarship, but also of my life experiences. Thank you all. This lecture this evening is dedicated to you. An inaugural lecture is intended to convey the sum of a speaker's accumulated learning, but in my case that probably means we should probably just start on the canapé straight away. I devoted almost 2 decades to the study of the United States, but recent events on the other side of the Atlantic have reminded me of the experience of the young poet Rupert Brooke when he traveled to the US in 1913. You know, an American returning aboard the same ship remarked, "You'll never understand America. No Englishman can understand America." It's an opinion shared by some of my critics across the ocean. For reasons both personal and intellectual, I have more recently turned away from the domestic history of the US to what is in some respects, I admit, a veiled form of therapy, the sometimes special but as often specious relationship between that nation and ours. When Britain awoke on the morning of the 9th of November to the startling news that American voters had elected Donald Trump President of the United States, many political commentators took it as read that there would be potentially serious consequences for the transatlantic special relationship. Prime Minister Theresa May sounded a note of diplomatic harmony by reiterating the common values of freedom, democracy, and enterprise that she claimed bound together Britain and the United States. In sounding warnings about the future of the Anglo-American alliance, the press and political establishment assumed the firmness of its historical foundations. But just how special is the special relationship? My lecture this evening aims to show that the partnership between Britain and the United States has been more historically contingent than is commonly supposed. For all the diplomatic platitudes about shared values and ideals, the special relationship has essentially been a utilitarian tool to further the self-interest of both nations, especially Britain, which has relied far more than the United States on sustaining the alliance. The lens through which I'll assess this phenomenon is the memorialization by each country of the other's wartime leaders, the politicians most synonymous with the special relationship, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. It probably won't surprise those of you familiar with my Eeyorish temperament that I've chosen this celebratory event to talk about death. Although my focus is indeed on two dead white men, I want to provide what is hopefully a distinctively Sussex approach to the subject. There is, as you can see just from this slide, thank you Ahmed, an enormous literature on the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill, written primarily from their own vantage point. Drawing on Sussex's unique historical resource, the Mass Observation Archive, my paper provides an alternative perspective by assessing how the public celebrated and commemorated the two statesmen, concentrating less on diplomatic elites than on ordinary men and women. The story it reveals is more complex than the conventional narrow attention on the representatives of state. So just like a good game of football, this lecture is divided into two halves. I'm going to start with Roosevelt and then move to Churchill. On the morning of the 13th of April 1945, the nation awoke to newspaper headlines and radio bulletins announcing the sudden and unexpected death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The reaction was one of almost universal sympathy and grief. When I first heard of it, I just couldn't believe it was true, confessed one individual. It made me feel numb all over, as if someone in my own family had died. The fact that the president had died without seeing the Allied triumph over the Axis powers that he had done so much to engineer was a source of particular regret. I think it's very sad indeed, him dying now, asserted another person. It's a shame, him dying without seeing the victory. The death of any American president has always been a cause of national mourning, but what's so striking in this case is that the nation was not the United States, but Britain. The testimonies about feeling as though a friend or family member had died that I've just quoted were made not by American citizens, but by members of the British public. Roosevelt's passing was a source of great sadness to a British people who believed they owed him an incalculable debt of gratitude for the wartime alliance against Axis forces. It was Roosevelt who had overcome the pervasive isolationism of the American public and political establishment to secure aid to Britain under the Lend-Lease policy of March 1941. Roosevelt, who had, together with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, established the ideals for which the Second World War was fought in the Atlantic Charter of August 1941. And Roosevelt, who had eventually led his country into a transatlantic military alliance against fascism following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Britain therefore mourned the late president with as much, if not more, intensity of feeling as it would one of its own statesmen. In contrast to the customary partisanship of the press, the Daily Mail spoke for all sections of the media, perhaps for the first and last time, when it proclaimed that the president was the greatest friend Britain had. Such sentiment appeared to unite Britons across the political divide, from left to right and from establishment to person in the street. Parliament adjourned in tribute to the late president. Flags fluttered at forlorn half-mast above the muted streets of London as its citizens mourned his death. Thousands crowded into St. Paul's Cathedral for a memorial service in his honour, while huge crowds huddled outside to listen through loudspeakers. I've been surprised by the depth of affection he seems to have inspired in all sorts of people, declared one mass observation respondent. All the people I've talked to today seem to be genuinely sorry about his death. All classes. The reverence with which Roosevelt, and this just gives you some indication, this is a Daily Mirror cartoon, in a notion that Roosevelt is not somebody who should just be consigned to the past, that he still points the way to an uncertain post-war future. The reverence with which Roosevelt was held eclipsed even that of another great American president, Abraham Lincoln, the 80th anniversary of whose death was also honored in 1945. Historian Adam Smith has shown how many Britons venerated the ghost of Lincoln, because more than any of their own politicians, his eloquent articulation of the values of democracy had helped them to make sense of the sacrifices of the First World War. Lincoln's rhetoric had provided comfort and inspiration half a century after his death, but the emotional connection with Roosevelt was even stronger because he had personally come to the aid of Britain in the contemporary war effort against fascism. This cartoon by E.H. Shepard of Winnie the Pooh fame, published in Punch, suggested that while Lincoln was known as the great emancipator because of the abolition of slavery in the United States, Roosevelt had helped to liberate all of the peoples of the world. Indeed, many ordinary Britons held Roosevelt in greater adoration than not only Lincoln, but their own Prime Minister. One mass observation respondent recalled her husband trying to calm her when she cried over Roosevelt's death by reassuring her that at least it wasn't Winston Churchill who had passed away. She wasn't comforted. "I like Roosevelt better," the woman asserted. "He was a man of the people. Churchill's an old trollop, only out for his own classes, doesn't care for anybody except his own class." The novelist C.P. Snow reflected that, quote, "I don't think I've ever seen London quite so devastated by an event. Even my old landlady was crying. The underground was full of tearful faces. Far more than if Winston had died, I'm sure." The sense of gratitude felt by many Britons towards Roosevelt encouraged support for a permanent memorial in his honour. While the government assumed responsibility for the creation and maintenance of an appropriate memorial site, the organisation of a public funding appeal fell to the Pilgrim Society, an elite association established at the turn of the century to facilitate goodwill between Britain and the United States. Public reaction was overwhelming. In less than a week, donations from over 160,000 people had raised the £40,000 appeal target. Numerous ideas for the location and form of the memorial were considered before it was decided to erect a statue of the President in London's Grosvenor Square. Architect B.W.L. Galliner received the commission to convert the muddy brownfield site, littered with rusting American military equipment, into a stylishly paved greensward. The statue that would serve as the centrepiece of the renovated square was the work of renowned sculptor Sir William Reed Dick. While there was little dissent about the desirability of a statue in honour of Roosevelt, its design aroused heated debate. These differences of opinion about the depiction of the late president reveal much, I think, about popular attitudes towards physical disability and its public representation in post-war Britain. Roosevelt, as you're probably well aware, had been permanently paralysed from the waist down after contracting polio in the early 1920s. Acutely conscious that the social stigma of disability could compromise his political credibility, the president refused to be seen in a wheelchair and made use of iron braces and the aid of another person to walk short but still laborious and painful distances. Photographs and newsreels invariably showed him seated on chairs into which he had to be lifted before the flash of the camera bulb. In a memorandum of April 1945, civil servant Eric de Norman conceded that a statue in honour of the late president would receive criticism whether it represented his disability or not. While it might be desirable to show him seated in a chair, he wrote, it could expose us to the criticism that we had not risen to our subject. Such was the dilemma faced by sculptor William Reed Dick. I'm assuming that many of you have actually seen the Roosevelt statue in Grosvenor Square, but here it is. Ultimately, Dick determined to convey Roosevelt's statesmanship by showing him standing tall and resolute, albeit with the aid of a cane, a fist clenched over his heart as he stares determinedly towards the middle distance. Although the statue was in keeping with the public face that concealed the president's personal affliction, Dick's design divided opinion. On one side were those who believed that it respectfully symbolized the president's triumph over physical adversity. Despite his disability, Roosevelt had figuratively stood tall against the greatest challenges of his time, the Great Depression and the Second World War. As one correspondent of the Times affirmed, at the greatest moment of his life, he stood erect. That was the essence of the man. To its supporters, it was less important that the imposing figure standing atop the plinth literally represent the late president than that it outwardly symbolized his inner spirit of strong and determined leadership. According to the Yorkshire Post, the memorial must above all convey the President's contribution to the cause of humanity, an allegorical purpose that, quote, demands not a painstaking record of personal characteristics, but a great and dignified piece of sculpture, symbolic of that spiritual strength which discounted physical infirmity and defied all the vast power of an evil aggression. On the other side of the debate were the many critics who advocated a more accurate and honest depiction of the President. Former Prime Minister Winston Churchill asserted that reminding the public of all Roosevelt had achieved, despite his physical disability, would best fulfill the didactic purpose of the statue. Here I have to resist my desperate urge to do a Churchill impersonation. I'm going to hold back. It was in the seated position that Roosevelt fought his way through the party politics of the United States for more than a decade, Churchill informed his successor, Clement Attlee. And it was thus that he played his great part in world history. Led by Labour MP Tom Dryburgh, more than 100 politicians from all main parties signed a motion protesting what they described as the inadequate and unworthy design. To these politicians and the many members of the public who wrote dissenting letters to the national press, the deliberate concealment of the President's disability implied that it was a weakness, and thereby demeaned both the man and his accomplishments. Labour MP Mont Follick, what a great name, spoke for many proponents of a more empowering depiction of physical disability, in scornfully comparing Dick's design with another memorial to one of the nation's heroes. How ridiculous it would be, he concluded, if Nelson's statue had 2 arms. Cartoonist Victor Weiss, my absolute favourite political cartoonist of the 20th century, satirised the disagreements over the statue by suggesting some less than flattering representations of still living statesmen. I'll leave you to work out who is who. Eventually, though, it was the symbolic rendering of Roosevelt standing tall and resolute that won the day, having secured the endorsements of the Royal Fine Arts Commission and, most importantly, of Eleanor Roosevelt. I realized from the outset that whatever you do will not please everybody, the former First Lady informed the Memorial Committee, as there are people just as anxious to remember him standing as those who recall him sitting. Indeed, the statue failed to appease fully either side, being dismissed by many commentators as neither truly representational nor symbolic. As the Reynolds News concluded, the standing figure was acceptable in principle, but in practice, Dick's inability to capture the President's likeness meant that, quote, only a dog on a lead is needed to complete the representation of an old, blind beggar. What Dick struggled to capture in sculptured form proved less complicated for the written word. In an encomium to the late President, published to coincide with the unveiling of the memorial, poet laureate John Masefield rhapsodized that despite his physical affliction, the President possessed a spirit strong as time, the third line there of that verse, that had enabled the world to defeat fascism. And then the last 2 lines, through him the horror passed and we rejoice. Our countries are released and freedom stands. On the 12th of April 1948, a springtime sun suspended against a bright blue canvas of sky greeted dignitaries gathered at Grosvenor Square to commemorate Roosevelt. The band of the Royal Marines performed a rousing rendition of the Stars and Stripes Forever, followed by the choir of St. Paul's Cathedral leading the luminaries congregated in the newly landscaped gardens in singing the 23rd Psalm, The Lord is my shepherd. King George VI then paid a poignant tribute to the President, proclaiming him one of the foremost architects of our common victory in the Second World War. The King then accompanied Roosevelt's widow Eleanor for the unveiling of the statue. The solemn service ended with a dedication by US Ambassador Lewis Douglas and benediction from Archbishop of Canterbury Geoffrey Fisher, inevitably accompanied by singing of both the Battle Hymn of the Republic and the British National Anthem. Although the event served to commemorate the recent past, the British government also intended it to celebrate the present and future ties between their own country and the United States. Britain emerged from the Second World War with its economy in ruins. The Labour administration elected to power in July 1945 was dependent on the US to finance its ambitious social reforms at home and to assume military control of Britain's strategic commitments abroad. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Anglo-American alliance had waned to the point where the two nations viewed one another with mutual dislike and mistrust. The Roosevelt Memorial therefore provided a symbolic reaffirmation of the Anglo-American alliance, a means by which the British government could strengthen faltering transatlantic ties and secure US diplomatic, military and financial support. Viewed from a post-Cold War perspective, the special relationship can seem preordained. Yet by resisting the temptation to read history backwards and focusing on events and their interpretation at the time, the emergence of the Anglo-American alliance appears much more contingent. Numerous factors had contributed to a chilling of the relationship between the two countries immediately after the war. The sudden cessation of Lend-Lease immediately after the conflict came as an astonishing and bitter blow to an economically bankrupt Britain, incapacitating the government's reconstruction program. It was a great shock, affirmed Prime Minister Clement Attlee, whose administration only learned of the decision, to add insult to injury, from a BBC radio broadcast. The tap, concluded Attlee, was turned off at a moment's notice, a comment satirized by this American newspaper, as Uncle Sam turns the tap off Lend-Lease with an indignant John Bull. Attlee's government dispatched economist John Maynard Keynes to Washington to negotiate a new loan from the United States. The terms of that loan, however, were far less generous than the British anticipated. Keynes had expected the Americans would feel a moral obligation to compensate Britain for its disproportionate contribution to the war effort by providing a large, interest-free loan. Instead, the US offered $3.75 billion rather than the hoped for $5 billion, and at an interest rate of 2%. Even then, conservative opposition to what one politician depicted as a Britain that practiced too much damned socialism at home and too much damned imperialism abroad meant it took a further 6 months to secure congressional ratification for the agreement. The terms of the loan also obliged Britain to open up its imperial markets, abolish exchange controls, and make pounds sterling convertible to US dollars within a year of the first payment. It took only 5 weeks for the Bank of England to exhaust its limited reserves of US dollars, creating the very financial crisis the loan was intended to avert. As historian Kenneth Morgan asserts, the US loan terms of 1945 did more damage to British trade and finance than all the bombing raids of the Luftwaffe. British resentment about the loan accounts for a mass observation survey of December 1946 that only 21% of respondents had a positive impression of the United States. There were several other sources of tension between the two countries. The Mcmahon Act of 1946 compounded British mistrust and resentment of the US by ending wartime nuclear cooperation. There was further friction over the American government's efforts to pressure Britain to accept the settlement of tens of thousands of Jewish refugees into Palestine. The British press reacted furiously to American criticism of its government's handling of the Palestinian problem. It used the continued oppression of African Americans in the Jim Crow South to accuse the US of hypocrisy for criticizing the British for their callous disregard of the rights of dispossessed minorities. American criticism of British colonial rule in other parts of the world elicited a similar response. The Americans laugh at our imperialism, asserted a female mass observation respondent in 1947, but they should look at their own democracy with its colour bar. The British left showed a particular hostility towards the US. Labour Party politicians and supporters continued to seek accommodation with the Soviet Union for at least the first 2 years following the war. In the same year that the Roosevelt statue was unveiled, Newsweek reporter Fred Vanderschmidt produced a book titled What the English Think of Us. The answer was not very much. Although the British public had taken Roosevelt into their hearts, that did not translate into a broader embrace of Americans or America. According to Vanderschmidt, 3 years after the end of the wartime alliance, 1 out of 3 Britons were more or less antagonistic to anything that came from America, from Buicks to businessmen. In this broader context, it becomes clear that the Roosevelt Memorial Ceremony, while motivated out of a sincere desire to pay lasting tribute to a politician genuinely beloved by the British public, also served a diplomatic purpose of rethreading fraying transatlantic ties. Its celebration of the special relationship represented a calculated effort to harness American power to arrest Britain's own decline. In a memorandum of May 1942, Civil servant Harold Butler asserted that the future political relations between Britain and the United States largely depend upon the extent to which Americans can be brought to understand the nature and magnitude of the British war effort. If they regard our contribution to victory as having been secondary and second-rate, they will consider our views on the peace settlement as of secondary importance. The memorial ceremony fulfilled this agenda. In exalting the Transatlantic wartime alliance, the event underlined Britain's claim to £2.8 billion in Marshall aid, more than any other European country, without which the new welfare state would have been unsustainable. This cartoon from the Daily... Why am I using the Daily Mail so much? Satirizes the economic situation and dependency of the British state on the United States after the war, showing here the British line thirsting in the desert for US dollars. Although Britain received more than 25% of all Marshall aid, there remained strong resistance to the program among congressional Republicans hostile to socialism who threatened constantly to cut appropriations. The memorial event also served to emphasize the value of renewed military partnership through the creation of a North Atlantic security system that would protect against Soviet aggression. It seems to me essential to our whole welfare today that we should have the best possible relations with America, opined newspaper magnate Sir Campbell Stewart. I think the Roosevelt Memorial, both in the manner of the raising of the funds and the prompt recognition of its aims by another land, may have proved to have been one of our most useful acts. The fulsome coverage of the ceremony in the US press confirmed this assessment. Honouring the late US President facilitated the efforts of the British government to overcome residual American isolationism and Anglophobia, drawing Washington into closer strategic ties with London as the Cold War intensified. In celebrating Franklin Roosevelt, the British establishment promoted a politically usable past to combat an uncertain global future. Ironically, although Roosevelt served as a symbol of the transatlantic ties between Britain and the US, it's actually unclear whether the late president would himself have been a willing partner in the special relationship. Roosevelt had no innate affection for Britain. Although tempered by wartime expediency, he was a trenchant critic of British imperialism who drew analogies between contemporary nationalist insurgencies against colonial rule and the founding of the American Republic a century and a half earlier. Strategic differences over how the war should be fought, especially the issue of the Second Front, and what sort of global order should emerge out of the conflict, increasingly set Roosevelt-Churchill apart. Roosevelt's advocacy of multilateral free trade also put him at odds with Britain's imperial preference system. Despite the splintering of the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, his correspondence with Churchill also demonstrated a determination, until the day of his sudden death, to reach some form of accommodation with Joseph Stalin. He took efforts to conceal from Churchill the attempted arrangement of a bilateral meeting with the Soviet Premier, lying about his intentions when the Prime Minister learned what was afoot. Geopolitical pressures after 1945 might have compelled Roosevelt to maintain close ties with Britain, but only on the most conditional terms. No matter how intimate the United States became with Britain, the President was too much of a diplomatic polygamist to be bound to one special relationship. Winston Churchill did not attend Franklin Roosevelt's funeral. He did send a heartfelt telegram to his widow Eleanor, in which he proclaimed the entire British nation shared his sense of loss. A tearful Churchill also joined the mourners at the St. Paul's Memorial Service and spoke eloquently of the late President in a speech to the Commons. The Prime Minister's failure to travel to Washington was nonetheless a surprising diplomatic slight, given the supposed closeness of his relationship with Roosevelt. It was also a missed opportunity for him to make an impression on the new president, Harry Truman. Churchill claimed that the absence of numerous cabinet ministers who were attending the founding conference of the UN in San Francisco compelled him to remain in Whitehall. But historians have speculated that in a fit of wounded pride, Churchill sought to redress his declining influence on Roosevelt by insisting that Truman be the one to travel across the Atlantic, a symbolic gesture that would have reaffirmed Britain as an equal partner with the US. No politician on either side of the Atlantic did more than Churchill to promote the special relationship. But as historian Fraser Harbert has shown, although Churchill admired much about the United States, his advocacy of an Anglo-American alliance owed as much to political calculation as it did to personal instinct. Although Churchill's mother, Jeanette Jerome, was born and raised in Brooklyn, she made little effort to imbue her son with innate love for her native country. Churchill visited the United States on numerous occasions, developing a strong enthusiasm for the vitality of its industrial capitalism. However, he also railed against what he regarded as Americans' crass materialism and moral hypocrisy. Although Churchill enthusiastically encouraged US intervention in the First World War, he feuded bitterly with President Woodrow Wilson over military action against the Bolshevik regime that came to power following the October Revolution in Russia. He only reluctantly accepted the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and reacted hostilely to pressure by President Calvin Coolidge for the further disarmament of British forces. Churchill's hostility towards state interventionism also, importantly, made him a fervid critic of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, a position not forgotten by the president. It was only when confronted by Britain's inability to stand alone, first against the forces of fascism and then of communism, that Churchill strategically promoted diplomatic and military alliance with the US. On the 7th of March 1946, Churchill delivered his most momentous post-war speech, The Sinews of Peace, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. In his address, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe and promoted what he described as the special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States, as the surest means to protect global democracy from the ruthless expansionism of Soviet dictatorship. Reaction to the speech on both sides of the Atlantic was hostile. Although Truman had privately approved the address, the political furor that it fueled forced him to distance himself publicly. The American press proclaimed that a formal alliance between Britain and the US would be an act of provocation, likely to precipitate the very conflict with the Soviet Union Churchill claimed he wanted to avoid. Far better, the press concluded, to allow the newly formed United Nations an opportunity to promote a new global order of peace and security. This cartoon from the Richmond Times-Dispatch satirizes the situation, playing on the old notion that you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Here, that horse shaped like the United States. If you want to know what the significance of the crow is on its back, I have absolutely no idea. Some newspaper columnists and politicians also sensed an insidious ulterior motive to the proposed alliance, believing it to be a means by which Britain would attempt to draw on the military and diplomatic strength of the US to buttress an overseas empire it could no longer afford. A band of US senators issued a public statement denouncing Churchill's efforts to forge what they described as a new British-American imperialism. Journalist Jay Franklin similarly declared that by aligning themselves against a common enemy, the British would secure, quote, the blind, ungrudging, docile support from the United States for the retention of an empire that suppressed the democratic aspirations of millions of people around the globe. The deepening of the Cold War would in time lead to a reassessment of the Fulton speech. But American political commentators, even though they came to champion the prophetic wisdom of Churchill's warning of the threat posed by the Soviet Union, that antipathy that it helped to fuel towards the Soviet Union should not be seen necessarily as translating into inducing a more positive sentiment towards the British. It's a more anti-Soviet, but less pro-Britain. And Churchill himself seems not to have fully understood that. After his return to Downing Street in 1951, he persistently miscalculated in dealing with both Democrat and Republican administrations in Washington, overestimating the strength of his personal influence and underestimating how much Britain's global influence had declined in the new global competition between the competing superpowers of the US and Soviet Union. Churchill formed a very positive impression of Harry Truman when the two men first met at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. But although the Missourian had a far more warm relationship with Churchill than he did with, as he described him, the sourpuss, Clement Attlee, this did little to facilitate a bilateral foreign policy. Churchill remained steadfast in his conviction that Britain must maintain close ties with the US if it was to withstand otherwise irreversible decline. This resulted in a frequently fawning support of American diplomatic and military action, not least during the Korean War. For all of his efforts, however, Churchill failed to gain much leverage over Truman. The president dismissed his counsel on numerous occasions, including the Washington Conference of January 1952, when he declined Churchill's proposal for a summit meeting with the Soviets and pushed ahead with the appointment of an American admiral as Supreme Commander Atlantic over the Prime Minister's protests. The election of the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, pictured on the left, as if you didn't know, as president in November 1952, raised Churchill's expectations that Britain could stand shoulder to shoulder with the US against the challenges of the post-war world. But it was not to be. The formula of the formal personal chemistry between the two men was lost to time. Churchill repeatedly proposed a summit between Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. This attempt to thaw the Cold War freeze would also have the virtue, he believed, of restoring his own country's place at the high table of international diplomacy. Eisenhower, however, would have none of it. The president scorned Churchill's, as he described it, childlike faith in the ability of an Anglo-American alliance to resolve global conflict. As John Dickey asserts, Britain was no longer the special relation. It was merely one among a number of allies. Even when Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev did eventually hold a summit at Camp David in September 1959, British representatives were not on the guest list. Eisenhower buffed Churchill at almost every other turn, declining consultation on his aggressive stance against China, offering no advance notice of the United States' possession of the hydrogen bomb, and spurning a common strategy over the Suez Canal, the consequences of which would lead in 1956 to the severest breach of the supposed special relationship. But despite his diminished political influence, Churchill remained an enduringly popular figure in the US, not least because of the nationwide serialization of his 6-volume war memoirs, themselves a means by which he attempted to propagate the enduring importance of the special relationship. According to a Gallup poll in 1962, Americans ranked him their third most admired person in the world, behind only Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. As Churchill reached the end of his life, the American public and political establishment enthusiastically rallied to pay him their honor and respect. President Kennedy, who had mastered his rhetorical skills, listening in the bath repeatedly to recordings of Churchill's speeches, eagerly supported a campaign to make the British statesman the first foreign national bestowed with honorary US citizenship. Churchill first needed citizenship of one of the 50 states of the Union. One state legislature after another rushed to claim the British statesman as their own. The winner was Nebraska. With almost the unanimous approval of both the House and Senate, Congress then hurried through the law conferring citizenship on Churchill. On the 9th of April 1963, as you can see here, Kennedy formally proclaimed Churchill an honorary citizen at a ceremony held in the rain-drenched rose garden of the White House. A deeply touched Churchill, unable to attend in person, watched the BBC broadcast of the event from his Hyde Park Gate home. Churchill's passing on the 24th of January 1965 provoked an outpouring of sorrow from an American press which emphasized the indebtedness of the people not only of Britain but also of the world. It was front-page news across all American newspapers and magazines, the lead story on television and radio broadcasts. In an expression of transatlantic reciprocity, Washington followed the example of Westminster by approving a permanent memorial to the late Premier. On the 9th of April 1966, US Secretary of State Dean Rusk we have a particular bald guy there. removed the red, white, and blue veil to reveal the 9-foot bronze statue in a ceremony attended by 300 dignitaries, including Randolph Churchill. Illness had prevented President Lyndon Johnson from attending Churchill's funeral, but his absence from the memorial event alluded to something more about his attitudes towards the special relationship, and much to do with the increasingly fraught relationship between himself and Harold Wilson's government over the Vietnam War. The statue, which celebrated Churchill's famous raising of 2 fingers as a mark of victory, stood symbolically bridging a line between the grounds of the British Embassy and American soil. Sculptor William McVeigh's design aroused less controversy than William Reed Dick's memorial to Roosevelt. Despite some puritanical voices raised in protest, the statue featured the former Prime Minister, as you can see, holding a cigar. Indeed, McVeigh made sure the bronze Sir Winston would never be without a smoke by sculpting 5 further cigars in case a vandal snapped off the original. I would need Freudian analysts to tell me whether or not, in this particular case, a cigar, by the way, was just a cigar. Some of the Savile Row businesses that had once dressed the British statesman also protested that the creases in the statue's suit, a veritable orgy of undulating tat, according to the magazine Tailor and Cutter, were an affront to Churchill's dignity. McVeigh also confessed that the statue was not constructed precisely to scale, since he had slimmed Churchill by several inches at the waistline. When Churchill became an honorary US citizen, humorist Art Buchwald mused on its practical meaning. Churchill, he teased, will have to start drinking coffee instead of tea, bourbon instead of brandy, and most of all, he must stop smoking those Havana cigars. We can take anything in this country except the thought that one of our citizens is trading with Castro. More seriously, though, what, if anything, was the deeper diplomatic significance of the formal tributes to Britain's former Prime Minister? In an acerbic but insightful commentary on the Rose Garden ceremony, Conservative peer and historian Lord Altrincham cautioned that we must be careful not to confuse the American view of Churchill with the American view of Britain. It was, he concluded, a common mistake, and one made by Churchill himself, to assume that the reverence in which he was held by Washington translated into diplomatic influence. If anything, the honorary citizenship made matters worse by strengthening this country's comforting illusion that the United States esteemed Britain more than any of its other international partners. Although the American press overwhelmingly approved the award, their praise focused exclusively on Churchill as an individual. Moreover, while editorialists lauded his role in securing victory during the Second World War, they made no reference to his efforts to sustain the post-war peace through the combined diplomatic and military leadership of Britain and the United States. When the Los Angeles Times concluded that Churchill, quote, helped to bring 2 great nations into an alignment that shaped history profoundly, the sentiment was deep, but the emphasis on the past tense also telling. The speech that Churchill's son Randolph read on his behalf at the Rose Garden ceremony emphasized the future importance of the special relationship in maintaining the peace for which the wartime alliance had fought. Kennedy, by contrast, made no reference to the enduring strategic importance of the Anglo-American partnership. His ceremonial speech reflected eloquently on Churchill's heroic leadership against the Axis powers, proclaiming how during, quote, dark days and darker nights when Britain stood alone, its leader had mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. But it's nonetheless telling, I think, that when Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, flew to Britain to present Churchill with a passport-sized copy of the presidential proclamation, he also used the occasion to press the Macmillan government to surrender its independent nuclear deterrent for membership in a multinational nuclear force. What was more important to American politicians than the special relationship was their manipulation of Churchill and their use of him as an historical imprimatur for their more controversial policies. Kennedy attempted to mobilize popular support for his aggressive anti-communist strategy, including the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, by drawing parallels between his own actions and Churchill's stout resistance to fascism. Whenever and wherever tyranny threatened, proclaimed the president, he has always championed liberty. His life has shown that no adversary can overcome and no fear deter free men in the defense of their freedom. Republican Barry Goldwater got in on the act too, drawing an exculpatory analogy between his notorious presidential campaign speech, in which he proclaimed that extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and Churchill's urgent calls for rearmament in the face of the mounting threat from fascism in the 1930s. Although many at the time dismissed the British politician as a fanatic, he concluded history had proved him right, as it would Goldwater himself. Lastly, I think it's also instructive to note that not all Americans mourned Churchill. The literature on the special relationship is written almost exclusively from the perspective of diplomatic elites and political establishments. Political establishments that are almost exclusively white. But when we introduce race and ethnicity into our analysis of the Anglo-American relationship, we can see quite different conclusions that it is possible to draw. And that's certainly the case in the reaction of African Americans to Churchill's passing. African Americans, in truth, had an abiding hatred of the former Prime Minister, stemming from his refusal to extend the provisions of the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which had defined Allied war aims to the colonized peoples of the British Empire. Black political, and you can see some of that animosity here. This is an editorial reaction from an African American newspaper after Churchill gave the Fulton Address, in which he espoused the virtues of the special relationship. Here's John Bull clutching a bag that says Churchill's speech as he walks on the massed bodies of people representing the oppressed indigenous population of the countries colonized by British imperialists. Black political leaders believed Churchill to be a racist, intent on using American power to buttress Britain's crumbling imperial interests and thereby stifle the democratic hopes of people of colour around the world. Churchill appeared to embody the white power and privilege that African Americans were taking to the streets of US cities to overthrow. His death emboldened them to believe in the end of an era of global white hegemony. As the Chicago Defender, perhaps the most preeminent of all black newspapers, concluded, Africa and the rest of the black world have no apology to make for not bowing in tribute to Winston Churchill, the great white father, whose power and gift of oratory we acknowledge, but whose constricted field of vision and lack of concern for those struggling to be free we deplore. To have followed the white world in its inordinate adulations would have been an indecent, intolerable display of hypocrisy. Historians are often reluctant to predict the future, something that Adam intimated in his introduction. I'm nonetheless confident that half a century from now, Britain will not be unveiling a statue in honour of Donald Trump, nor the United States publicly commemorating Theresa May. What I've tried to show in this lecture is that not even the transatlantic memorialization of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, the two statesmen most identified with a special relationship, should be seen as evidence of a deeper affection and loyalty between the peoples of Britain and the United States. The statue of Roosevelt in London and of Churchill in Washington are comforting political symbols of a past that never really was. The relationship between the two political leaders and the nations they represented was always more complicated than the metaphorical message conveyed by their bronze likenesses. In that sense, these memorials are not only sites of remembrance, but also just as significantly of forgetting. It remains to be seen whether we will continue to draw inspiration from these symbols of past glories as we stare into an uncertain future. A recent personal experience, on which I'll conclude, may provide an appropriate allegory. Walking in London this summer, I turned into New Bond Street, where I was surprised by the sight of two bronze figures sharing a joke as they sat together on a bench. As I reached for my camera, some other pedestrians walked by and looked at me looking at the statue. Turning to the figures and then to one another, one of them raised an uncertain voice. "Who," she asked, "are they?" Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a delight it is to be here for the Professor of Modern American History's inaugural lecture. I have to say it's a double treat for me with the privilege of giving this vote of thanks. I've known and admired Professor Webb since, as Comet Clive, he blazed across the university skies of Sheffield as an MA student, I think getting on for a quarter of a century ago. Many of you here will know what a joy it is for a teacher to watch gifted students soar towards academic distinction, as Clive has done with his books and essays on the American South. I share Clive's regret that his doctoral supervisor, Tony Badger, and his chief academic mentor isn't well enough to be here to do the honours this evening. And etiquette, of course, demands that kind words be said on these occasions. But happily, I don't have to resort to formulaic politeness or to the etiquette of that other special relationship, the one between a former student and his teacher. We have just heard a memorable lecture, a rich and elegant offering, in equal parts original, shrewd, and entertaining, qualities widely recognized as the hallmark of Clive's work. Tonight, Clive has emphasized the historical contingencies in the relationship between Britain and the United States and the self-interested utilitarianism at work on both sides of the Atlantic. His means of exploring that relationship during the middle decades of the 20th century, the memorials to FDR and to Churchill, and the public sentiment that they in some instances reflected and in other instances misrepresented, are an analytical masterstroke. He leads us persuasively to his conclusion that the statues of Roosevelt in London and Churchill in Washington are comforting political symbols of a past that never really was, and that in obscuring the complexity of the relationship between the two leaders and their nations, the bronze memorials are not only sites of remembrance, but also of forgetting. Now, I'm unenviably aware that I'm the only obstacle between the Professor of Modern American History and his well-earned drink. I'm also aware, as I look at this representation in the far corner, of what happens to speakers who go on for too long. But let me briefly share a couple of reflections. First, we should thank Clive for showing us how far we've lost sight of the hold FDR had on British public imagination. He's revealed the depth of public grief at Roosevelt's death and the esteem in which he was almost universally held for rising to the economic and political challenges of the Great Depression. With the passing of time and the neoliberal disdain for state intervention and Keynesian economics, Roosevelt's New Deal has lost its luster, fading from view, and the powerful political coalition that he assembled of white, black, and ethnic working men and women had already unraveled long before Donald Trump, the Donald, hammered the final stake through its heart 2 weeks ago. In his day, Roosevelt was not only admired by the British public at large, but we should register how much intellectuals appreciated his role as a domestic reformer and a war leader. And this would prove a significant catalyst in the British acceptance of American history as a serious academic discipline. You may not know that a mid-19th century attempt to create a lectureship in American history at Cambridge was rejected in the belief that it would undermine the monarchy and the Church of England. Many at Oxford in 1921 treated the establishment of the visiting Harmsworth Chair in American history with contempt. A professorship? I hardly think the subject warrants that. And in the interwar years, opting for American history was a kind of academic kiss of death. But as the United States, embodied in FDR, came to be viewed as essential to the security of Britain and to post-war international relations, the academic world began to see the value of studying and teaching the history of the American nation. The fabric of the chair that Professor Webb occupies is woven in part from Rooseveltian cloth. My second reflection is this. I'm struck by the several parallels between British memorializing of Roosevelt in Grosvenor Square and a quarter of a century earlier, in 1920, the unveiling of the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Parliament Square. Lincoln's death in 1865 occasioned no less public grief across Britain than Roosevelt's did in 1945. It prompted anguished concern from thousands of ordinary working people, similar to those that Clive has captured from the Mass Observation Archive, whose voices were recorded in the torrent of local submissions to the American State Department following Lincoln's assassination. The circumstances surrounding Lincoln's statue half a century later, in the aftermath of the Great War, uncannily foreshadowed the tussle over FDR's statue. There was the question of the subject's pose. The first statue proposed appeared to suggest, from the disposition of Lincoln's hands, that his defining characteristic was chronic stomachache. And there was then the intervention of the family to resolve the awkwardness, in this case, Lincoln's son Robert. And there was poetic celebration of Lincoln too, above all the play by John Drinkwater, which ran for hundreds of performances in the 1920s, the era of the so-called cult of Lincoln. Citing Adam Smith's fine work on this episode and other aspects of British appropriation, of Lincoln's appropriation by British admirers, Clive notes how FDR supplanted Lincoln in the popular imagination. He showed us Shepard's Punch cartoon of 1945, which contrasted Lincoln's more limited significance as the domestic emancipator of American slaves with Roosevelt's role in liberating all the peoples of the world. And this, seems to me, is a nice example of a narrowing lens, since not many years earlier, Lincoln had himself been characterized, in John Drinkwater's words, as the world's emancipator, the champion of the rights of common people of all races to an equal chance in life. Clive's closing episode of the couple unable to identify FDR's statue hints that in this age, our age of flash celebrity, there are likely to be many in Britain today much more familiar with the 16th President Lincoln, thanks to Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis, than to FDR. And this is evidence that FDR needs his own Hollywood blockbuster to resurrect his reputation. Failing that, he requires an academic champion, a historian able to offer scholarly rigor, wise judgment, and entertaining prose. Professor Webb, your hour has come.